Well, good morning all. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional people who belong to this country, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay respect to the elders past and present, and I'd like to thank Sherry for leading us this morning. And I can't help but be inspired by the mixing of the soils. Patrick Dodson tells a great story up in Broome of the point where the salt water from the ocean meets the fresh water that comes from the creeks and the streams. And they come to a point where they get this brackishness, where they mix together, and you can't separate them. You can't unscramble them. And you know what it uses as a symbol for what is the truth of this country and what remains to be done. That we are all here, despite the wishes of many of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. Those of us who have come in the last 230 years are not going to pack up and go, but we've got to find a way to live here. And I think symbols like this remind us that we are in this together. And I acknowledge the Indigenous peoples who are here. Thank you for your leadership, and it's really a great privilege for me to speak today. And I'm going to try and speak to you rather than read to you. Is that okay? All right. And Tina, I have to tell you, from where I sit, you are definitely one of the younger members of the church, so thank you very much. Now, when we make that acknowledgement of country, I don't do that lightly or in a cliched way to cleanse ourselves, because the truth is that history happened here. It happened here, and that history is unreconciled. And as the old saying goes, if you don't learn from your history, you're bound to repeat the sins of it. And I have to say that time and again, Australia, we have, in our treatment of our First Peoples and of the last to arrive, we have much unfinished business to do. And Paul mentioned about what it was like to, in passing, to grow up as a Greek or Italian and Australian. And it's sort of interesting, if you look at our history, the way in which we treated our First Peoples and the way in which we treat the last to arrive, we've often pushed them to the edges, to the point of exclusion. And we have awful language like dago and spag and slopehead and wog, but after a while we move on to the next lot. One of the things we need to do as a society is really to own up to the truth of our history and to work hard to do something about it. We're not getting the leadership from certainly in the Parliament on that front, as we saw last week, and I'll have a bit more to say about that shortly. But it looks like being a great conference. So many issues of importance to be touched on. And I have to start by affirming Catholic social services in the country has been part of the hope of the side. And yes, the implications of the Royal Commission are profound and deep. We have to work our way through that, and I've got some thoughts about that this morning. But Catholic social services stand for supporting people and looking people in the face and walking with them in their everyday lives. And that's a damn good thing, particularly in this world of fake news, 24/7 news channels, reality TV, which I suggest to you is really escape from reality TV. I sort of wonder when we're going to get the conglomeration of dancing with the singing cooks in the jungle whilst going on a first date. It's just, let me escape from it. Let me escape, And we see that too, Donald Trump's tweets to Brexit, to poor old Barnaby Joyce's horizontal dancing techniques. I've seen so much of it. And last week was the 10-year anniversary of the apology to the stolen generations. It was mentioned across all media in Australia 2,200 times. Barnaby Joyce's situation was mentioned more than 46,000 times. And the other thing that happened last week was in the rejection of the Uluru Statement by the Turnbull government and the pledge by the Prime Minister that he would make this an election issue, we saw the death of bipartisan support for constitutional recognition of Indigenous peoples. And yet, if you went looking for it in our papers or in the news broadcasts, it was gone between the Prime Minister and his Deputy Prime Minister throwing hand grenades at each other. So there are big challenges here for us into picking all of that up. And of course, we come to the Royal Commission into institutional child sexual abuse. I mean, it's a good thing that we gather here to consider it, and it's a difficult thing. I mean, I've got to say, it's been a struggle for me. I work at the Edmund Rice Centre. Edmund Rice the Christian Brothers were founded by Edmund Rice. The Christian Brothers were certainly guilty, among others, of serious crimes of child sexual abuse. When the Royal Commission came to its conclusions and they were published, we were putting out information about Tuvalu and Kiribati, where we do a lot of work. And we got this blistering email back from a person who used to describe themselves, I used to be a Catholic, to say, how dare you be publishing information about this when the Christian Brothers who support you have been guilty of these crimes? And it pulled me up short, frankly, because I used to say, well, yeah, we know that, we accept that, we learn from that, we build from that. But I think the church has to turn its face to the reality. Yes, but doesn't help us in this moment of history. Yes, but in terms of, we run really good schools, we run good hospitals, we run good social services centres. No. Yes, but doesn't help us. The leader of the Christian Brothers, Peter Clinch, who's an inspirational bloke, said to me last night when I was talking about this, he said, look, these things happen when we lost our way from what Edmund Rice was about. And I think we can extrapolate that out too to the broader church. These things happen when the church lost its way from the mission that Jesus was on about. And that is to be at the service of people and not on about things like power and hierarchy and clericalism. That's led us up a very dangerous, dark path. So this opportunity is for us to look to how we create the new and build something better. And in doing that, we've got to be careful we don't get sort of cynical, you know, because I've always believed that cynicism is just an elegant form of surrender. Now, one thing we can't do at this moment in history is to surrender. The people we work with, the people we serve, demand that we don't do that, because we cannot lose our way at this moment in history. But I have to say the inspiration that I draw from the work of Catholic Social Services is important. We've got to hang on to that, but there's something else we've got to do. We need leadership that will encourage root and branch reform in the church and in the wider society. José Comblain, the Belgian theologian who lives in the Brazilian Amazon, he talks about the fact that the church can often, in moments like this, sort of be a bit like a castle with a moat and a big drawbridge, and you pull it up, and we think we're the only ones here, and focus on ourselves. And we hear leaders saying things like, you know, last year was an annus horribilis for the Catholic Church in Australia because of the Royal Commission and because of the plebiscite. Last year was not an annus horribilis for the Catholic Church because it is the moment that offers us liberation and redemption. If the truth sets us free, then having the sordid, horrible truth out has got to be a good thing than to continue to keep it secret. It's got to be a good thing. I'll tell you, I had an annus horribilis last year. Behruz Bouchani and the other men on Manus Island. The 2,000 people just under that as we sit here today are in Manus and Nauru and have been there for up to 5 years. They had a pretty bad year. There's a woman there, Mahmoud, and a 4-year-old daughter, and they live in a 4x2 plywood shack with a tin roof in Nauru. She's too scared to go out because two blokes on a motorbike attacked and robbed them recently. She spends most of the day crying. Her brother lives in the Sydney suburb of Panania with his family, as an Australian citizen. They came to Australia together on the same boat. They have the same story. One gets in, one gets out. See, we need people who will stand with and give voice to that. And if the lessons of the Royal Commission are anything, it's to hopefully enable us to double down to do that. We had a young bloke come into the Edmund Rice Centre about 18 months ago, and he was there to run a supporting service for people's legal cases and migrations casework. He was one of the 30,000 who are in Australia as the legacy caseload, who came in on the wrong particular day in July and were ruled that they'll never get to settle here. A lot of them are Sri Lankan. So this young man comes in, had his note to say, get ready to go back to Sri Lanka, knowing that if he went back, he'll be arrested at the airport. Our lawyer wasn't there at the time, so he walked down into the foyer, took a knife out of his bag and began to stab himself. One of our very brave Aboriginal women ran out, managed to get the knife off him. We rang the ambulance. The ambulance didn't come. We had the tactical response group that taped off the street and came storming into the building, heavily armed, 6 men. It finally took us about 20 minutes to say, look, this guy on the floor being held by Father Claude Mostovic, almost like a crucifixion scene, you know, wasn't a threat to anybody. So then the police rang the ambulance, but we didn't get the ambulance. We got the specialist ambulance response guy who came in and stood over the person prostrate on the ground and said to him, are you just doing this for the attention? Another half an hour of discussions with him, we finally got an ambulance. And by that stage, the Tamil community had gathered at Concord Hospital in Sydney and took him into their arms, and he's still there. Doesn't know if he can stay in Australia, though. See, these people matter. And I'm not telling, and all of you, every single one of you sitting in this room would have a story of a similar human being that has moved your heart. Because that's what Catholic social services do. You know, Sister Bridget Arthur said to me and to the big conference we had here last week in Melbourne, that what we've got to deal with in the moment in Australia is a calculated cruelty. A calculated cruelty as a social policy. And it applies to Indigenous peoples particularly, and it applies increasingly, obviously, to refugees and asylum seekers. The first peoples and the last to arrive. You know, and my concerns are if this continues, we will see the same sort of issues applied, attitudes applied to people with disabilities. So how do we work our way out of this? How do we deal with this Royal Commission? How do we serve the people in a renewed way without losing our way again? Look, about 20 years ago at a Let's Talk Reconciliation conference in Northern Ireland, the wonderful Olga Habnan, Indigenous leader from the Northern Territory, was asked by the Sinn Féin Mayor of Belfast what would need to happen for Australia to become reconciled. And she sort of got up and said publicly, we had a whole range of people. We had Sinn Féin, we had the DUP, we had the Paisleys, we had Jerry Adams was there, and all these sort of famous and good. And she said, look, 5 things, she said. First one, recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples of Australia. 2, acknowledgement that recognition means that we have to acknowledge the unique rights to land, culture, language and spirituality that flows out of that recognition. Thirdly, there has to be a commitment to social justice that's both formal and substantive. And all around the room, people are nodding, all the Northern Irish are nodding. Then she said, fourthly, there have to be negotiations in good faith. And people began to squirm a bit. And then she said, and number 5, to know that we've achieved it, there has to be a fundamental change in power relations. At that point, half the politicians went pale, and because they thought they were just going to pat the nice little black fella on the head. You know, thanks for coming, good on you. But they all had this profound message to send. And I think that when we talk about how we find our way back from the Royal Commission into a meaningful space, that these 5 steps of recognition, acknowledgement, commitment to justice, good faith negotiations can provide us with a template. And I agree with Francis Sullivan completely that it's not enough for the church to get its house in order. The house has to be rebuilt. And I would like to take this opportunity here this morning to pay tribute to Francis for his leadership on behalf of all of us and his witness on behalf of all of us in attending the Royal Commission for every day of its sittings. We owe him a great, great debt. And so using Olga's template, this is no time to put the wagons in a circle, as Bishop Coleridge says. There needs to be an honest and open recognition that this history happened, that the abuses and the systematic cover-ups occurred, that acknowledgement of the hurt and pain to the victims, their families and the Catholic people, and acknowledgement of the criminal culpability of a culture that allowed this to happen to be covered up. Now, a lot of that's already started. A lot of those admissions have been made. It needs to continue. There needs to be a commitment to justice that is formal and substantial. Victims must be heard, listened to, and compensated properly. In many instances, of course, this has happened, as I said. It needs to continue for a long time. But, and here's the crunch, there's got to be fundamental change in power relations in the church. The culture of secrecy, of unquestioning deference to the hierarchy must change. As the Royal Commission concluded, there was catastrophic failure of leadership and ultimately in the structure and culture of the church over the decades to respond to child abuse. This harm could have been avoided if the church had acted in the interests of children rather than in its own interests. That's a definition of losing your way. But here, in that conclusion, lie the seeds of a future of putting us right, putting it right. Because those of us involved in Catholic social services and the punters in the church, in the pews, need to see the outcomes of this Royal Commission as an opportunity for redemption. I believe that is possible. Not only possible, it's going to have to happen. How do we do it? The late and great Cyril Halley, Columban, used to say to me regularly, "You won't hear the gospel at the centre, brother. You've got to go to the edges." You know, Pope Francis says, "Go to the fringes." And that's where our social services often are based. You know, go out on the Vinnie Night Patrol. You know, listen to things that John Falzon says. Listen to the things that Frank Brennan says. You know, we hear that, and we have many strong, powerful individuals who are able to give voice to that to not just the church, but to the society. That's a source of hope. José Comblan also talks about his concern for the fate of Western Christianity, and he sees its over-adherence to what he calls the religious pole as opposed to the gospel pole. And they don't have to be mutually exclusive, of course, but Comblan says in the West, increasingly, that's been the problem, that the Western Church focuses too much on this religious pole that requires a tight hierarchical caste system, a priestly caste, with a focus on rules and regulations, on tightening and straightening of judgments of who is in and who is out, hell-bent on defending the institution. He says the gospel pole, however, takes you back to the social reality, to engagement with the poor, the excluded and the marginalised. It takes us to places that are messy, chaotic, heroic, painful, joyful. The ups and downs of life, where lives are lived, the places where Jesus hung out and the people he hung out with. So the focus of our energy in those places. Now, Royal Commissions, of course, don't deliver lasting change. I mean, it's 27 years after the Royal Commission, Frank, isn't it, into Aboriginal deaths in custody, and the situation concerning Indigenous incarceration rates is worse now in 2018 than it was when the Royal Commission made its recommendations. Change will only come when it's demanded. When it's demanded, and it's got to be demanded by us. That task is up to all of us. Unquestioning loyalty to the institutional church should no longer be espoused as a fine Catholic attribute. I'm quoting Frank Brennan here. We Catholics need to get better in our firm, respectful and demanding encounters with our hierarchy. Moreover, to question is to care. Not enough questions were asked in the past. That was the culture that was, that's the culture that's got to change. Now, this wonderful work that we do, and I use that term absolutely deliberately, is essential for the society that we live in. You know, and to encourage us to engage with the factors that oppress people. I mean, liberation presupposes oppression. So the environmental destruction we heard about again last night, the poverty, racism, discrimination, and an economic order that reduces people to servants of an economy rather than human beings. Now, Jack de Groot has heard me say this 1,000 times, and I'm going to say it again. The notion of a citizen is something we've got to defend in this country. The paradigm that we've got at the moment sees us living together in an economy rather than living together in a society. Why is that significant? Because if you live in a society, you are a citizen with rights and responsibilities. If you live in an economy, you're a customer or a consumer with access to choices. You know? And you'll hear it when you all get back on planes to travel around the country. Would customers flying to Sydney please board? You know, what's going on? If you go to the bank to renegotiate your mortgage, like I did recently, the bankman said, "Oh, we've got some wonderful new products for you, Mr. Glendenning." See, banks no longer provide services; they sell products. And in my state of New South Wales, by dint of regulation in the Parliament years ago, you weren't entitled to call people who live in a psychiatric institution or a hospital a resident or a patient. Everybody's a client. Then what are you purchasing? 6-pack of manic depression pills to take away, please, Peter. You know, what are we purchasing? If we reduce every relationship just to an economic one, well, where sits the work that we're on about? See, I think we've got to reclaim the language. The German philosopher Klaus Offer years ago talked about the 3 coordinating mechanisms in a society like ours: the government, the market, and the community. And he said those 3 things have got to be in some sort of harmony for the effective functioning, not just of the economy, but of the society. And he said if you get leaning too much from the government just with the market, you end up with the American insurance business. And if you end up just with the government and the community, he said you could end up with, like this, had the warehouses full of spectacles that were created but no one would wear in the Soviet Union. The community sector has a role to play. That's us, not just in the church, in the society. And it worries me when I hear community sector people speaking the language of the government or the market. And of course, that's a tricky path we've got to tread if we're getting funding from those sources. You know, you've almost got to be a non-compliant complier. But I'll tell you a story. I was recently at an educational conference in a big city to the north of this one, and it was Friday afternoon. It had been a 3-day conference. 3:15, well, everyone's got their bags packed and the taxis are waiting outside. The social justice bloke gets a run, right? Yep. This is what's called the hospital pass in rugby league parlance. So up I get, and the person on before me was an academic from San Diego who was saying, listen, you got to make sure you deliver a fair and effective outcome for your shareholders. The stakeholders have got to get a say. Your shareholders have to get a fair return on their investment. And I'm sitting there going, huh? And I got up and I thought, oh, they're all flying, leaving the country in the next 15 minutes. I'll go to have a crack at this. And I got up and said, I think he was talking about parents and their children. Half the room are with me, the other half, invitation hasn't come to return. But the point I make is, you know, the language is important. Because when you strip back the language, you reveal the assumptions. And when you reveal the assumptions, you strip them back, you reveal the values. And the values that are at work through that type of language and discourse are not the values of the gospel. That's the value of the market. So where sits the person with disabilities trying to grapple their way through the new system? Where sits the child with learning difficulties? Where sits the 92-year-old woman in a nursing home who's just gone in for the first time? My mother-in-law. And to wade your way through that process of getting people into a nursing home, bonne chance avec la. Because it's all been driven by the power of the dollar, not the power of love. Now, sure, the government got to do that. The market works to different principles, but we don't have to be driven by that. And if we do, we've lost our way. And you'll also, we will hear very clearly that when that happens, as Paddy Dodson said in the Parliament not so long ago, if we're not attentive to the words we use and the assumptions and values they represent, this enables and emboldens an ideological creep back to bigotry and to racism. Or as David Irvine, who was one of the Northern Ireland people up on the dais when Olga was speaking in Belfast, who was a Protestant, Northern Irish ex-bomber terrorist who did 9 years in Longkesh. He became great mates with Patrick Dodson, the ex-Aboriginal priest. And we invited David to come to the treaty conference in Australia. And he talked, I said to him before he went up, he said, "Oh, I'm so nervous. I said, "Well, would you like to go over your notes?" He said, "I'm not going to read to him, I'm going to speak to him." And he went out on the stage in Canberra, the convention centre. It was live on TV. Politicians all washed through the building. And he said, in his wonderful Irish brogue, "I can smell racism. It doesn't grow wild in a field. It's tended in a window box. And your Prime Minister's got a very green thumb." Up to that point, we were going, this is really good. And again, in a speech last year, when the whole debate about 18C was on, Patrick got up and said, "If this nation cannot stand up for the weakest, the poorest, those who are most vulnerable because of their race, their ethnicity or their beliefs, then we become a very sad replication of what democracy is about." And in the same way, if the Catholic Church in Australia now, in this point in history, cannot stand up for and be seen to stand up for and to be heard to stand up for the weakest, the poorest and those who are most vulnerable because of their race, their ethnicity, their beliefs or their health, then we would be, in the words of John Paul II at Alice Springs Indigenous people, a sad replication of the church that Jesus wants us to be. And the good news is this is the work of the Catholic Social Services. This is our work. But it's under threat through that dominant economic paradigm, through a society at the moment that would rather look at the shenanigans of a politician sexually rather than the reality of people's lives. See, last week was a classic of this dichotomy. I was in the Parliament at the time of the apology. It was one of the great days in our history, with lots of hope that the substantive change would come. It didn't. It hasn't. And last week should have been a chance for us to focus on this unfinished business. It wasn't. We can't let it go. We cannot let that go. We cannot be silent. Martin Luther King said many years ago that it's the silence that speaks the loudest. The silence that speaks the loudest. We begin to die the day we are silent about the things that matter. We cannot be silent about the things that matter. These 24 million refugees around the world, the same population of Australia. They're not just numbers, they're human beings. Brothers, fathers, sisters, mothers, friends, their children, more than half are children. I wanted to... And that's what fires me up. Frank said to me the other day, let's talk about how we maintain our passion. I've got a few things to show here. Oh, there we go. That's me, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, I am here. But to stay focused on the things that fire us up, this fires me up. And I don't make any apologies for showing it. This is in Quetta, on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. It was in the morning, and I know I've shown this to many of you before, and I make no apology for showing it here again. A bomb's gone off when the Taliban have driven a truck into the market. This town is where the Hazara minority go because the United Nations have set up a centre there to get people processed for their refugee asylum claims from Afghanistan. And of course, they're in Pakistan because you can't claim asylum in your own country. You've got to leave it. The bomb's gone off. 174 people, mostly women and children, died. This was in 2011. Every year, this goes on in this town at least once or twice. And the death toll goes up. You won't read about it in the Australian papers. The poster at the back, with a big circle around it, in the words in Dari, say, "Don't risk your life going to Australia by boat." Put there by the Gillard government. And been put there every year since by the Abbott government, the Rudd government and the Turnbull government. Every year it costs about $31 to $33 million of our taxpayers' money to run that campaign in these border towns. Imagine what we could do with that money. You know, Malcolm Fraser, that well-known crypto-pinko socialist, used to say to us, you know, that if you count the military costs, Australia has been spending upwards of $5 billion. He reckons more like $8 billion to keep these people out. The thing that's interesting in this, though, is that the Hazaras have gone up to rescue the people who are still living and to remove the dead. I was in Kabul 2 years ago when a bomb went off about 6 blocks from where we were. All the glass fell out of the windows. We dive under the bed, get the phones out to see the emergency numbers. The Hazara guys we were with ran out into the street to see who they could rescue before the next one came in. You know, and these are the people that at the moment we're rounding up and sending back. So we're going back to Afghanistan in 3 weeks' time today to meet up with these people and find out what happened, because their lives matter. We did this. So that fires me up and keeps my passion going. And then we have the situation for so many of the 24 million in the camps. These are the camps in Syria, just outside Aleppo, the people of Aleppo, rather, in Turkey. And you've got countries there, millions and millions of refugees who just want to go home. You know, Australia's focused on resettlement. They all want to come here. No, they don't. The vast majority of refugees that we know through the Refugee Council want to go home if they can, but some can't. And then Gillian Triggs got into so much trouble for raising this, and this fires me up as well, asking the children, what's your experience like in the detention centres when you come here? So I won't say anything, I just want to show you some of these. And yet the vast majority of people seeking asylum that come to this country come by plane. They don't come by boat. I'm yet to hear Alan Jones or Tony Abbott get in the media and say, you know, stop the planes. Because the vast majority come into Sydney Airport. That's the truth. There's something about us and boats. Ever since the first boatload of unauthorised arrivals turned up in Sydney in December 21, I think, 1788. Maybe they hold up a mirror to the rest of us. Because that's how, unless you're Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, that's how you got here. You or your people came from someplace else. We're all boat people. It's like a war we wage on ourselves. I think we've got to work hard for a bipartisan commitment again. Not just to recognise people, but to deal with the unfinished business. And the great news, of course, is Aboriginal people have survived and are showing and leading us the way, as we heard last night from Miriam. We can't accept what happened in the Parliament last week. We just can't accept that. So I'm going to wrap up. I want to conclude with two thoughts. We're talking about hearing, healing and hope. To actively listen, to actively hear the words of an Iranian asylum seeker in detention who said, anonymous, I do not know what will happen after I die. I do not want to know, but I want the potter to make a whistle from the clay of my throat, And may the whistle fall into the hands of a naughty child, and the child to blow hard on the whistle continuously, with all the suppressed and silent air of his lungs, so that it may disturb the sleep of those who are dead to my cries. The voice of that asylum seeker, I hear the same thing reflected in Indigenous communities. I hear it reflected in those who are excluded. They need not to be spoken about, spoken on behalf of, but to help create the space when that voice can be heard. That's what the Catholic mission is about, I think. But to do that, I think we need a strong, articulate, eloquent voice in the public sphere, a Catholic voice that is not just the hierarchy. I think we need a people's movement in the Catholic Church. What's a people's movement? A coalition of people who take action around shared values. And if you think about it, the change has happened. You know, go back 50 years, if I'd said to you that these things are going to happen, Nelson Mandela's going to get out of jail, that's not going to happen. That we're going to have an environmental movement. A lead singer of Midnight Oil is actually going to be a minister. Not necessarily a good one, but you get my drift. You say, go to Tasmania and hug a tree, Frank. You know, those things happened. East Timor, the Philippines, the Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union ended. The change happened. The women's movement, the peace movement. That gives me hope. And in standing in solidarity with people like that, that's where we will find our healing. Well, actually, the last thing I won't go into great detail, but the sin is an opportunity for us to do that. You know, Vincent Long said that we need a church that's less an enclosure for the virtuous, but more an oasis for the weary and the downtrodden. Less an experience of exclusion and elitism, and more an encounter of radical love, inclusiveness and solidarity. Less an attitude of we're right and you're wrong, and more openness to the truth wherever and from whoever it is to be found. Less a leadership of control and clericalism, but more a diaconia of a humble servant exemplified by Christ at the Last Supper. Less a language of condemnation and more a language of affirmation and compassion. Less a preoccupation for its own maintenance, but more a concern for the kingdom and the people of God. Now, people will say to me often, you've seen too many Walt Disney movies. You've got too much hope, son. It's never going to happen. All those things happened historically. The great Irish poet Seamus Heaney talks about, you know, people will tell you sometimes it's hard to hope on this side of the grave. But sometimes in the tide of nations and people, the great tide of justice rises up and hope and history rhyme. Let's go and get some clay whistles and start blowing them loudly to disturb the sleep of those who are deaf, who can't hear. Let's pick up a pen and let's go and write that history that leads to hope. You know, Barack Obama said in his last press conference, the arc of history is long, but it tends to justice. And people said, oh, it's a bit too social deterministic. But no, it's not, because it's people who do the bending towards justice. That's our task. That's where we'll find our hope.